Qua.
Prego, prego. Buongiorno a tutti, grazie. Grazie a tutti per la presenza, benvenuti. Saluto il Ministro, grazie per essere qui, il Presidente della Delegazione italiana presso l'Assemblea.
Good morning, everyone. It's an honor and a pleasure that the Chamber of Deputies is welcoming the GSM of the NATO PA. This year we are celebrating the 75th anniversary of NATO, and at this special time we are extremely happy that NATO went from 12 founding members to 32 allies working together in order to guarantee the security of our people. NATO plays an essential role, and even more so at this historical time when it comes to the global landscape, but also in other matters. I'm thinking here of terrorism and of the more and more frequent attacks. The cyber attacks, disinformation. Unfortunately, we are going through a complex time, and especially since Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. But it's not the only threat that we are facing. I'm thinking, as I have just said, of terrorism, but I'm also thinking of what we see in the Indo-Pacific. I'm thinking of the instability as well on the African continent and in the MENA region. Today's meeting illustrates how we are closely following the political developments in these regions, the challenges, the migration crisis, and it requires of us to be more committed. And all regions are becoming more and more important in terms of security at the global level. Italy's diplomatic role is also extremely important. Italy developed very important relations outside of the West by having a very solid tie with the Arab world and with Africa. Italy's relations with other countries is an added value for the alliance as a whole. Italy tries to have build a constructive dialogue with other actors on the political stage, and against this background, I would like to underline the role of the NPA, who plays an important role at the intergovernmental level as well. I believe we need to strengthen the ties between national parliaments and the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. We need to raise awareness amongst our public opinions when it comes to defense and the democratic values of the alliance, and when it comes to security as a priority. Overall, the NPA represents a driver in bilateral and multilateral relations. It prioritizes dialogue, mutual understanding, and the sharing of common values of freedom, democracy, and rule of law. And this parliamentary summit of or the Washington summit, which will take place on July the 8th and 9th, and our assembly just before the NATO summit shows how parliamentary dialogue is extremely important and its added value. Thank you very much.
Volevo ringraziare il signor Presidente della Camera.
I would like to thank the Speaker of the Chamber of Deputies of Italy. I would like to thank him warmly. Indeed, if yesterday, today and tomorrow we are able to meet, it's thanks to the Speaker of the Chamber of Deputies. Thank you very much for your words. Today is our second working day. I believe that yesterday was a very successful day. We dealt with a number of topics. We are facing important challenges on the eastern flank, the southern flank, in the Indo-Pacific region, cybersecurity, on water security. And as countries, what is our role here? We need to shift our attention towards the southern flank of the alliance. And even in Washington, we have to make sure that one of the core pillars of NATO, which is this 360-degree vision, can materialize. Yesterday, during the dinner, I thanked the Finnish delegation. I saw how active and how involved they were here. We, Italy, are there for all NATO events, everywhere and always. And I believe that during the Washington summit, we must show that the Mediterranean region and the southern flank requires all the necessary focus and attention. We need to anticipate, we need to prevent. We are all aware of the situation, of the global situation. And I believe that what is important in this session, in this GSM, well, I said that I took part in a number of meetings with our friends from Algeria, from Bahrain, from Iraq. We also had a chance to exchange bilaterally. But what is important is to gather a number of Mediterranean countries. Representatives of all of the Mediterranean countries are here with us, and therefore I wish to thank you for that. I wish once again to thank the Speaker of the Chamber of Deputies. And now we will be starting our work for the second day. We have with us today the Minister of the Environment and Energy, Mr. Pichetto, and I thank him for being here. Now, without further ado, let's start our work, but I would like to read the letter that was sent by the Speaker of the Senate. Dear Chair, unfortunately, due to other commitments, I was unable to attend this GSM today, organized by the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, taking place from the 6th to the 8th of May. However, I wish to send to yourself and to the delegations my warm welcome and my warm greetings, also on behalf of the Senate. It's an extremely crucial meeting in order to keep cooperating and collaborating amongst ourselves, but also between Italy and the EU, and the cooperation we have launched with countries of Africa and the Middle East. The participation of the countries of the Mediterranean southern flanks side by side with NATO countries is an extremely important milestone. Through dialogue, we can speak of potential solutions to the crises we see and foster our national security, but it's also about our region as a whole. This was a letter by Ignacio La Russa, Speaker of the Senate, so I would like to thank him as well. But I would also once again like to thank all of our friends who came from all the corners of NATO and of the Mediterranean. Yesterday, we had a very successful working day, and I very much hope that today will be the same. Lorenzo Fontana, I can't thank you enough. Without you, we wouldn't have been able to hold this meeting. Thank you.
Iniziamo la quarta sfide.
It seems that the mic is not working, says the speaker. Seems to be working now. Apologies. We are starting our fourth session, Shared Socio-Economic Challenges, Energy, Food Security, Climate Change and Migration. We will speak of two crucial pillars for our security and pillars very important to mitigate tensions. The common denominator of these pillars is the climate change, and this is why our solutions, of course, will be complex solutions and will have to be linked to one another. Countries have been very dependent on Russian gas rather, and they have shown resilience by being able to find over 12 months other energy supplies by, amongst other things, negotiating agreements with Algeria. But in the current scenario, what is important is to develop our energy sovereignty and exchange mechanisms between our countries of the alliance and our other countries. We will be able to hear Gilberto Pichetto Fratin, Minister of the Environment and Energy Security of Italy, which I thank for his presence. He was previously Deputy Minister for Economic Development under the Draghi government and Vice President of the Piedmont region. A few days ago, the Minister welcomed, as part of the G7 Italian presidency, the G7 Minister meeting on climate, energy and environment, and he will be able to say a few words about it this morning. Minister, you have the floor. Thank you, Chair. Dear Lorenzo, thank you very much for having invited me here today, and good morning to all of the guests here today. I'm particularly glad to be here this morning. A few days ago, we had the G7 on environment and energy, and I have the pleasure to be here and repeat a number of concepts that were broached during this meeting, concepts that are also extremely important within your event. The Turin Declaration launched a strong leadership message. This declaration spoke of the environmental crisis, energy crisis, amongst others. And all of these challenges are very strong. There are challenges not only for the G7 countries, but also for other countries. In this sense, we have reasserted our support to Ukraine. We committed as well to repair and protect critical infrastructures that have been destroyed by Russia. And in this Turin Declaration, we enshrined a strong statement to become independent from Russian gas. And there was a strong leadership and strong actions which stemmed from this charter that we signed. And we have also decided to widen our scope of interest. We turn towards as well Mauritania, Algeria, Kenya, the African Development Bank. They were there also at the meeting. But since we are speaking of the Mediterranean region, there were also Brazil, the presidency of the G20, and so on, as well as the European Commissioner. It was a very inclusive approach, and this G7 was also seen as a bridge towards Africa. Italy has this very strong vision when it comes to building equal partnerships with the African continent, and this is what the G7 also wanted to do. This vision has been inspired by the Mattei plan on the Prime Minister Mrs. Meloni, and a number of initiatives were also taken, addressed at the most vulnerable countries. We had a long session on this topic, and we drafted a number of specific paragraphs on energy, on access to clean energy. 43% of the African population does not have access to this energy, and we wrote a lot about renewable energy in this plan. We also wrote about the goal of supporting, from an energy standpoint, the African continent. Our desires for them to produce enough energy in order to feed into their development, and also use a sustainable development such as solar panel. And we want to strengthen the energy security on both sides of the Mediterranean. Our statement also stemmed from what was said during the climate conference, the most recent climate conference. Renewable energy was also seen as a necessary element of the energy transition. The idea is also to produce hydrogen energy, hydrogen-based energy. It's one of the widest sources of energy on the planet, and this would allow us to not rely anymore on fossil fuels. I would also like to recall that the European Union would like to rely on 20 million tons of hydrogen by 2030.
Now, of course, this would be internally produced and would be imported from the north, for example, at EU level. Buying hydrogen from the United Kingdom, for example, is an option, but that is an import, right? We have energy coming from Norway as well. But let us not forget that we can also buy energy from the south. Let us really keep that in mind, especially when thinking about renewables. Because after all, diversification means strengthening independence on both sides of the Mediterranean. I would also like to talk about rare earths, because talking about energy security doesn't just mean talking about renewables. No, we also have to take into account rare earths. And there too, we have to become more independent. We have to produce green technology. The National Energy Agency says that we'll need 7 times more rare earths by 2040. So again, we need to be very mindful of the dominant players in that market. Again, we can't become completely dependent in this very strategic sector. Let me recall also that there are countries right now that fully control the treatment of these raw materials, rare earths. I'm talking extraction of lithium, for example, which is very much on the agenda at the moment. Just by way of example, China really manages extraction of over 50% of lithium produced worldwide. China is also the country that has the greatest capabilities to transform these various raw materials. I think that it's mostly China that transforms lithium. Up to 80% of worldwide lithium, I think, is transformed in China. So again, we have to move away from potential monopolies. And this leads us to look closely at major or dominant players in this market, because again, we cannot fall in this dependency trap in strategic sectors. This is true for Italy and for the EU. And so we're taking the necessary measures. Even before the war in Ukraine, Italy had started working on strengthening its knowledge and governance in that area. We had created a critical table of, or a table of critical raw materials. At an EU level, I think we need to follow very closely the initiatives taken by the Commission. The Commission has launched a preparatory phase for a new shared acquisition plan for strategic raw materials. This shared acquisition plan will cover various raw materials and will cover their extraction, treatment, and recycling. Of course, Western countries represent a lot of value in this market and at a geopolitical level. Now, let me just conclude by talking once again about the current context in terms of insecurity. I think that in that context, we need to focus on initiatives that favor stability. And I think stability really is linked to cooperation. This is why we launched an initiative to strengthen cooperation with developing countries. We strengthen our cooperation, especially with more vulnerable countries faced with climate change. Of course, socio-economic development is absolutely key in that context. In developing countries, the impact of climate change is harshly felt. And so we also need to work on socio-economic indicators. We need to make sure that countries can adapt to climate change and that they can deal with the consequences of it, especially in more vulnerable communities. I think you're all very well placed to understand how important it is to invest in initiatives that aim at preventing instability. We need to invest in various projects that allow access to clean energy, to encourage biodiversity protection. That is how we can ensure growth for poor parts of the population. It's how we can prevent migratory flows as well. It's how we can prevent economic crises and instability. Let me just recall that at the G7, we committed to a certain number of measures, including the creation of a sort of a partnership between the 7 countries for water. Water really, of course, is a very important topic. We represent the richest countries on earth at the G7, so we need to ensure good management of water resources through good management of various technologies. We need to really make sure that everyone has access to water. That is key for human life, of course. Again, thank you for allowing me to speak today. Thank you very much, Minister. I'm now going to give the floor to our next speaker, a good friend of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, Paolo Messa. He is a senior fellow at the Europe Center of the Atlantic Council. Well, thank you, Alberto. Good morning, everyone. It really is an honor and a pleasure to extend my greetings, along with those of the Atlantic Council, to the opening of this second day of the GSM session of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. I extend my warmest greetings to all the distinguished authorities present, and of course, I particularly thank Lorenzo Cesa and Fernando Gutierrez. Mr. Cesa is president of the Italian delegation to the NPA, of course. I would also like to express my sincere gratitude to all members of the parliaments gathered here and the Italian delegation, of course. As I said, I'd like to thank all members of the parliaments gathered here today. Whatever your country, political affiliation, each of you represent a crucial link between the Atlantic Alliance and the fundamental values of democracy upon which this organization was founded 75 years ago. The timing of this session in Rome couldn't be more relevant. Russia's ongoing conflict in Ukraine, the escalating tensions surrounding Taiwan, the profound crisis in the Red Sea are 3 factors that mean that we urgently need to redefine our concept of collective security. For decades, we saw NATO primarily as an organization towards the eastern border in response to the Soviet threat then and to the Russian threat now. However, I think it's only recently that we have understood the strategic significance of the NATO southern flank, as can be seen with the creation of the GSM group and the command in Naples, which we'll visit tomorrow. Now, in reality today, we find ourselves faced with a threat that is, of course, affecting various domains, but that affects the cyberspace, space, and, of course, the underwater domain as well. Now, the debate over whether the Eastern or Southern Front is more important is now obsolete. The IMEC, Indo-Mediterranean corridor, proves, I think, that there is this transition going on, and I think this transition will lead to great results. There is such an interconnectedness between us and between our adversaries as well. China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. There's a strategic alignment there, and that's a reality we can no longer ignore. Responding to such a global threat, of course, demands proportional response and robust deterrence. And NATO has those capabilities. And I think its greatest strength lies in the enduring bond with its member nations, facilitated through you, through parliaments. Now, today we're focusing on food and energy security. These are 2 non-military issues, and it might be difficult to imagine NATO debating about these issues, and yet these are indispensable pillars for addressing the challenges of collective security in the Mediterranean region. Just think of the implications of conflicts on energy security, food security. The crisis in Ukraine and the Red Sea have a direct impact on our economies and on our security. It's not just about stability and prosperities for countries in the Mediterranean and the Middle East. Of course, we want to work with these countries to deal with malicious influence from Russia, Iran, China. But we all are involved, and I'm not just talking about Italy, Greece, who are very much exposed on the southern flank of the alliance. No, I'm talking here about all countries. Just look at inflation. It shows the impact of these destabilizing activities. The strategic concept adopted in Madrid in 2022, so 2 years ago now, says that energy and food security are key aspects. Now, 2 years after the adoption of this strategic concept, we realize that these crises are reshaping the landscape of our collective security and cooperation. The Washington summit in July, I think, will play a key role in NATO's future. And let me now just speak as an Italian citizen and not just as a member of the Atlantic Council. Italy is going to welcome the G7 summit, and the topics addressed here today will also be addressed, and very much so, during that G7 meeting, especially food security. And this G7 initiative ideally would go hand in hand with a concrete plan, and that plan is being worked on by the Italian government right now. It's a very precise and strategic plan turned towards Africa, the Mediterranean, and the Middle East. And that's the Mattei plan, as we call it. Of course, there's also the European Union's Global Gateway that contributes to those same aims. So all of this work done by the G7, by NATO, need to converge towards the same aim. We can't just act in isolation. No, we need to talk to one another. And of course, that is what we do in our respective parliaments as well. So, yes, I hope that all of you individually and collectively will be able to play an important role to develop more efficient policies in the face of the challenges of the future. Today's work will decisively contribute to Washington's discussions, where I will be. So again, thank you to all of you, and all the best for today.
Grazie Paolo, abbiamo visto quanto...
Thank you, Paolo. So clearly, all of these topics are very much interconnected. I suggest we now move on to the first panel of the day. We'll talk about, well, energy and food security. Will you be staying with us? Good. We'll be happy to have you at the table with us for the rest of the panel. Now, first we're going to watch a video, if I'm not mistaken. It's Maximo Torero Colin, who is a chief economist at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, so the FAO. Here's his video message.
I want to present today food security, inflation, and socioeconomic instability in the MENA region. As you will see in this PowerPoint, the situation is very unstable, and there is a lot of action that will need to happen to be able to recover to normal periods. First, let me focus on food security and where we are in terms of food security, what is happening today. If we look at food security, while global hunger remained relatively unchanged at around 9.2% from 2021 to 2022, there was a notable increase in hunger in the MENA region in this period, from 9.6% to 10.2%. Increases were seen in both sub-regions from 2021 to 2022, from 5.9% to 6.4%, like you can see in the yellow line of this graph, and in the North Africa, and from 12.4% to 13.1% in the Middle East. In 2022, the prevalence of undernourishment in the Middle East was double that of North Africa. An estimated 36.5 million people were facing hunger in the Middle East in 2022 and 13.8 million in North Africa. Now, the two countries with the largest proportion of the population facing hunger, and as part of the heterogeneity in the region, are both Middle East are in Syria and Yemen. So you will see in the middle the yellow bar for Yemen, and also you will see the bar in the left from the Syrian Arab Republic. More than a third of the population of Yemen faced hunger in 2022 and between 2020 and 2022, although this is an improvement compared to about 38% in 2014 to 2016. In Syria, nearly 28% of the population faced hunger in 2020-2022, 2.5 times the level in 2014 and 2016. Iraq and Djibouti also have high prevalence of undernourishment, 16.3% and 16.8% respectively, although improvements were seen in both countries compared to 2014 and 2016. When we look at the prevalence of moderate or severe food insecurity, that's now another proxy indicator we have for SDG 2. And moderate means under and overnutrition, and severe is similar to chronic undernourishment that we have explained before. But globally, the prevalence of moderate or severe food insecurity was 29.6% in 2022, about 2.4 billion people. And the prevalence in the MENA region was higher, 32.9% in 2022, equivalent to 162 million people. This includes the 10.4% of the population facing severe food insecurity, equivalent to 51 million people. The prevalence of moderate or severe food insecurity was higher in the Middle East, 36.6% compared to North Africa, 28%. But the prevalence of severe food insecurity was similar. While moderate or severe food insecurity decreased from 2021 to 2022, in both subregions, severe food insecurity has increased. And severe here is shown by the red dark color, moderate is by the orange color. Now, when we look at acute food insecurity, that means a snapshot of the short-term impacts over lack of food. That's what we use in emergency. We will see that the MENA region is facing significant challenges, both Algeria, Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, the Gaza Strip, Syrian Arab Republic, and Turkey. 36.7 million people, or 54% of the analyzed population, face high level of acute food insecurity in 2023 in 9 countries and territories. 22.2 million people forcibly displaced in 9 countries or territories in 2023, consisting of 12.3 million IDPs and 9.9 million refugees and asylum seekers. And 0.8 million people were acutely malnourished children under 5 years old in 2 countries, with 0.2 million of them suffering from most severe form of acute food insecurity. In the right-hand side, you can see the share of analysis of the population facing high levels of acute food insecurity, being Palestine, the one with 100% of the population in IPC3 or above, followed by Jordan, Egypt, and Yemen, and the Syrian Republic. The situation and the displacing situation on MENA is extremely important. The numbers of IDPs, refugees, and asylum seekers in the region have substantially increased to 22.2 million people displaced people, 12.3 million IDPs in 3 countries and territories, and 9.9 refugees and asylum seekers in 8 countries and territories, as can be seen in this map. When we look to the Gaza Strip and focus on Palestine Gaza Strip, we see a significant deterioration of the situation. So 2.2 million people, 100% of the Gaza population, face high levels of acute food insecurity, means IPC3 or above. Not only that, when we compare the data from December 2023 to March 2024 to July, we see that in December to February, 1.2 million people, or 53% of the population, was in emergency, IPC4. Between March and July, this number went to 0.8 million people, or 38% of the population, and the reason was there was a significant increase in IPC5 population. In December to February, we had 0.6 million people, 26%. In March to July, 1.1 million people, or 50% of the population, were estimated to be catastrophic, or IPC5. There is 1.7 million people displaced by the 31st of January of 2028, and this has significant impacts, and the conflict has impacted not only the production, the facilities, the infrastructure. It's significantly damaged that will take significant time to be able to be replaced. Now, one of the major topics, because this region is a net food importing region, is inflation. And MENA has seen an adverse set of countries facing significant problems. There has been the Gulf Cooperation Council developing all exporters and developing importers. The paradigm of the 2 different subregions in MENA no longer holds, and all MENA countries are net food importers, and inflation and socioeconomic stability is closely related. In the left-hand side, you see the relationship for global and MENA, and you will see in the red line MENA and in the dark global. As you can see, they move very similarly. Of course, global has a higher spike, but prices are still a problem in the MENA region. If we look at the MENA country groups, the Gulf Cooperation Council, the developing of oil exporters and the developing of oil importers, you will see that the case of the developing of oil exporters are showing significant increase in the median inflation. So this region is facing still significant problems of inflation. The core inflation or the annual inflation rates have eased in most of MENA countries since late 2023, after a period of recovery, in line with global trends. Nevertheless, inflation remains persistently high in some countries. We see high inflation between 33 and 71% in Egypt, Iran, Lebanon, Palestine, and Syria. We see a moderate inflation, 2 to 8%, in Tunisia, Algeria, Kuwait, Israel, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Libya. And low and stable inflation, less than 1% in Qatar, Morocco, Bahrain, Iraq, and Oman. So we have a set of countries, Lebanon, Palestine, Iran, Egypt, and Tunisia, that still are facing significant levels of core inflation. The key drivers behind inflation are exchange rate fluctuations, the valuations of natural currencies we have in Lebanon, in Sudan, in Egypt, in Syria, currency depreciation against the US dollar in Syria, Iran, Egypt, and Tunisia, but also shortages of foreign currency reserves and trade deficits, which doesn't allow them to be able to stabilize the exchange rate, and some supply chain disruptions in Lebanon, Sudan, Palestine, Syria, Algeria, and Tunisia. So the geopolitical conflicts and tensions, of course, has brought a significant problem to these countries. Now, remember that there is significant level of price controls and subsidies and trade regulations in many of these countries, as you can see in the right-hand side. Now, food inflation is a key driver of food insecurity in MENA. The share of consumer expenditure on food exceeds 20% of households' budget in many countries. Food inflation remained elevated in Egypt, Iran, Lebanon, Palestine, Tunisia, and was rising in Bahrain, Jordan, Israel, and Qatar. Cereal prices were record high in Sudan. The key drivers, of course, are conflict and high insecurity levels, weak currency, as we explained before, and adverse weather conditions on domestic agricultural production. In the left-hand side, you will see the rates of food inflation. In Lebanon, more than 50%. In Palestine, more than 50%. In Egypt, more than 50%. In Iran, a little bit more than 30%. In Tunisia, around 10%. So these levels of inflation are enormous and, of course, are related to conflicts, especially what is happening in Palestine and in other regions. In the top 10 countries, territories with the highest food inflation rates in nominal terms, 3 are in the MENA region: Lebanon, 181%, Egypt 51%, and Palestine 33%. For inflation in real terms, 2 out of 10 countries with the highest inflation rates are in MENA region, Egypt and Palestine. Now, what is happening in terms of the socioeconomic instability? There are 3 major drivers that we have been seeing. COVID-19 and Ukraine war create an effect over inflation and food insecurity and employment and poverty. Conflicts and displaced population, brain drain disruption, socioeconomic impacts on neighborhood hosts, and climate change, of course, that brings land degradation, water scarcity, a key element in this region, biodiversity loss and depletion of marine and aquatic resources, an increased number of natural disasters. All this increased fragility in the agri-food systems in the region. So the 3 key drivers, COVID-19 and Ukraine war, conflict and displaced population, and climate change, has a significant impact on food insecurity and is a reflection of what has been observed in the latest years. There is a general, when we look at the GDP growth and the reduction of inequality, we see a general deceleration of GDP growth of 2.6% due to conflicts, climate change, and economic shocks. Poverty has been rising poverty compared to pre-pandemic years from 31.5% in 2019 to 35.4% in 2023, and a stable projection for 2025 is 35.1%. Inequality has remained still high. The Gini coefficients generally range from 30 to 37% higher and in higher income countries. And the deep inequalities persist between rural and urban areas, between smallholders and large agricultural producers. So these problems really affect the incapacity of this region to be able to recover, because you need to reduce poverty, to reduce hunger, and of course, to make this sustainable, you need a significant reduction on inequalities. The labor market has been alarming. There is high unemployment rates in 2023, particularly among young people, 26.4%, and women 20%. And this is due to growth of youth populations, that's the demographics, and stable economies and vulnerable shocks, mismatch between workforce skills and demand of employees, that's an issue of human capital, is more a structural issue, and other socio-political factors like low labor force participation among women, limited access to finance and services for medium and small enterprises. So there is a significant prevalence of informal employment associated with limited access to social protection, income inequality, and remaining poverty. The level of inequalities, as mentioned before, of course, put fuels into these disparities and this lack of access to formal jobs and full jobs. Again, this is also reflected in education and health. There has been some improvements in school enrollment, completion rates, and pre-primary school, but they remain low, and high prevalence of non-in-education employment or any type of training, among 30.7% among youth, and there is important gaps in need between men and women, 42.9% of women falling into this category versus 19.1% of men. Health, there is some improvements in maternal mortality, achieving of SDG 2 under 5 mortality, and average universal health coverage index increased between 61% to 69%. But COVID-19 reflected the impacts of underinvestment in conflicts in public health with important disparities. The UAE is with the world's highest fully vaccinated population at 90%, and Yemen fully vaccinated only 1% of the population. Again, these inequalities and disparities is what is the most important problem in this region. Social protection is central. We have seen in Latin America that social protection was the major way in which they cope with a shock of COVID-19. This again brings the concept of resilience, the capacity of absorption. In this region, only 40% of the MENA with at least one type of social protection are limited for children and elderly people, active populations. There has been significant disruptions of social protection in conflict-affected countries such as Yemen, Sudan, and Libya. There have been some improvement in the readiness of social protection systems in countries affected by shocks in recent years, such as Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, and Iraq, and ongoing reforms to improve coverage to informal and rural workers and enhance linkages with employment policies in most countries in the region. So, colleagues, let me stop this presentation by arguing that there is a huge importance in MENA region to increase resilience. And that what it means prevention and capacity of absorption. Prevention in the sense that we need to be ready with early warning systems so that people and farmers can be prepared with the One Health approach and with mechanisms of insurance and tools that will allow them to be preventive. But capacity of absorption, which is the most important, is linked to social protection. On the first instance, that's our first line of action, social protection, to assure that the most vulnerable populations, especially in a region with such a level of inequalities, will be ready to any shock. But second is efficiency, how we can produce more with less. In this region, especially how we can use better the water, how we can use it more effectively, how we can increase more resilience to shocks, and also how we can be more prepared to shocks of conflicts. We have seen conflicts have been increasing, and we need to find ways in which we can ensure early action to avoid the problems that we are facing today and the problems that we will be facing in the future. Again, our motto is good food for all today and tomorrow. And that means not only that we need to provide more and better with less today, but also that we will be to be efficient in the way we use our natural resources in the future. Thank you so much, and I hope you had a great day. Dear colleagues.
Interessante il contributo di Massimo Torero Gullen, che non è potuto essere qui con noi.
Many thanks. Unfortunately, the speaker couldn't be with us because he has commitments at the FAO. Food security can be seen as a second main pillar of stability. Russia has disrupted cereal supplies, grain supplies to the third world to be able to provoke huge migratory flows towards Europe. And this is why we need to pay particular attention to the MENA region. I'd like to give the floor to our friend, the professor from Venice. And he is an expert on the Middle East. He works on climate security, energy security, and he's also a fellow, research fellow for Russia and the Central Caucasus. He's a director of the Institute for Russian and Caucasian Studies. And he has a string of diplomas and fields of competence, Azerbaijan, food security, etc.
Professor Carlo Frappi, prego.
Grazie molte per la lunga...
Many thanks. Many thanks for your kind words of introduction. It's a pleasure for me to be with you today.
Si sente meglio, spero adesso. Ok.
And I hope that you can hear me. So, great honor for me to be here. And you've invited me to speak about food supply needs and requirements in Europe and the link between Europe and the MENA and the Middle East region. So what I'm going to do is take about a quarter of an hour to give you some background information about the main issues which will allow us to see the opportunities and also the challenges of this region. Both opportunities and challenges are enormous when we're talking about energy cooperation between the European Union and the MENA region. I'll start off by speaking to the causes and the scope of the energy market and requirements in the European Union. There is and has been a crisis for the last 3 years, which derives from 3 main causes. Firstly, we had the pre-invasion period, pre-invasion of Ukraine by Russia. We saw energy demand upping after the pandemic, after a 10-year period within which prices had remained very stable. And so very little investment in the energy field during those 10 preceding years. So what we did is we just slammed straight into the wall of the crisis provoked by the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. It was a triggering factor which triggered the energy crisis which we know now and which exacerbated it subsequently. And the energy field is the main battlefield, if you will, because European consumers were starved of their gas supplies and of their main gas supplier. A further complicating factor was the fact that this spiraling conflict with Russia brought us to the apex of a multiple crisis situation, because we're talking about not only one crisis. What we're seeing is some form of chain reaction of crises, the sum of which is beyond the individual components. What I mean is that we've got these synergies between different hotspots and crises, and of course the sum total is greater. For the European Union, this was a real challenge. And I would say a double challenge. Firstly, there was this short-term challenge, and then the mid and long-term challenge. In the short-term period, following 2 winters without Russian gas, Europe has managed, we can say, to substitute its gas supplies using other forms. and of course by reducing its own consumption. But let's look into the medium and the long term. What's the situation there? We will need to really fundamentally overhaul our consumption and supply patterns in Europe by diversifying sources, of course. And we must decarbonate our consumption. Reducing the release of greenhouse gases between now and 2030 to get to some form of level as fixed in the forecasts adopted in 2005. Two absolute priorities in the short term to be able to find alternative gas supply sources to replace Russian gas supplies. This means that we must stabilize our supply patterns, while of course respecting environmental requirements. The European Union gave more priority to supply chain security than to other considerations. So a question of saving and a question of environmental factors, those were basically sidelined. But these three factors remain, and the European Union needs to be up to the challenge on all three fronts. In other words, diversifying its sources, saving, reducing gas consumption, and being more environmental as far as greenhouse gas releases is concerned.
Che i nuovi supply.
We have to do so by focusing on several points. On the one hand, suppliers, whether they are new suppliers or former suppliers, must make sure that there is the sustainability from an economic point of view and from an environmental point of view. Europe must make sure that we can cooperate when it comes to gas supply, and also push green energy and push for renewable energy overall. As for the Middle East and North Africa, in the short run, this area was extremely important to guarantee the stability of flows. And here I have Algeria in mind in particular. Therefore, this region played a very important role in providing energy supply to Europe. And it's no surprise that we turned towards the Mediterranean region for our supply. So Egypt, Israel, and so on. The EU turned towards this region for its energy supply again as of 2022. And in 2023, 20% of European gas supply is LNG. And the remaining part of the gas is liquid gas from Qatar and from Gulf countries as well. Now let's look at the medium and the long term. The MENA region will stay extremely important, and it's even going to be growing importance. Energy cooperation will be extremely fruitful and now and in the future, especially when it comes to hydrogen, which can be transported, stored like other energy fuels. And this decarbonization process that we are seeing in Europe will also go through a growth of green hydrogen. And therefore, the big European economies will have to import this resource more and more from outside of the EU borders. Some of the three main importers of green hydrogen are three European countries: France, Germany, and Italy. This initiative was launched with the European authorities' full support. I'm thinking of the initiatives via Spain, via the corridor that goes through Italy. So we have this corridor that was developed together with our Austrian and German partners. And once again, it illustrates how we are switching and looking towards this resource more and more. And there will be opportunities to negotiate important agreements between the public and the private sector. After 2022, the state took on a bigger and bigger role in energy supply. So there are a number of opportunities and possibilities, but there are also a big number of challenges. And here I would like to underline 4 challenges. The first one, the challenge of sustainability. The European Union and member states will put a higher demand on our suppliers. However, we must make sure that these countries don't fall on a strategy that will jeopardize the environment. I'm thinking here of fracking, of shelling. And if these countries turn to that, then it will be counterproductive for us. And therefore, we have to keep in mind the decarbonization process, which is crucial. The previous speaker also spoke of decarbonization, and it's a very essential concept. It's important because also energy is tied with other issues such as migration, especially when it comes to the work of the EU. And the other point is that we have to help our traditional energy partners transition to a post-oil era. And we have to, with this in mind, preserve the balance. This is why we have to help our traditional partners in this post-oil world, because we will reduce our demand of fossil fuel in the future. The second challenge is the challenge of investment, necessary investments to implement green infrastructure. And here it seems that our partners are a little overwhelmed. This is why we will have to leverage private investments. And private investments will have to work hand in hand with public investments and investments of the international banks. And there is also an uncertainty around the gas demand. And this is slowing down investments. We see that in all of our regions. Third challenge, which is at the crossroads of the first two challenges I mentioned. We spoke of promoting investments on infrastructure. We spoke of durability. Now, if we want to invest in sustainable energy, we need to guarantee security. And security, once again, is at the heart of our focus. Yes, the war of Russia on Ukraine has brought back a number of issues on the table. But following that situation, the issue of energy security once again was before us. And we are thinking of energy security also with the military dimension in mind. Today, energy is once again used as a means of leverage on countries. So we spoke of critical infrastructures, critical on the sea infrastructures, and this infrastructure is located in an area, in hotspots areas. It's also located in the Middle East, so the notion of security once again becomes extremely important, and energy infrastructure and their protection are priority goals now. We saw it beforehand when we spoke of the crisis in Yemen. We've also seen the drone attacks by the Hezbollah on offshore Israeli infrastructure, just to illustrate how much we need this element of security. And then the fourth challenge, and maybe the most potent challenge, is the following. It's a political challenge and a diplomatic challenge. The EU and the EU member states are high-flying players in the MENA region. Nonetheless, we are seeing that the European influence in this region is dwindling. And why so? For two reasons, because of two interconnected dynamics. First, there is the growing pressure coming from a number of countries, China, Russia, and so on. And secondly, the European we see the disengagement and the withdrawal of the US vis-à-vis Europe. And on the other hand, we also see difficulties in dialogue between the EU and Turkey. Turkey here is a very important actor in the area and one of the most important players in this area I've just mentioned. Therefore, today we need an integrated and concerted European action, and this leads me to my conclusion. We need an initiative which integrates the energy security and energy supply in a 360-degree strategic vision. We have to be careful not to work in silos, and if the crisis with Russia has taught us one thing, it's that the link between energy and politics is a very delicate one. We cannot discard diplomacy when it comes to the energy sector. We cannot leave and abandon the regulation of energy to the private market. This would be a big mistake. And we mustn't repeat that mistake that we did with Russia, with the MENA region. The various stakeholders of the MENA region are extremely important, and our energy supply in Europe will heavily depend on our ties with the countries of the South Mediterranean. Thank you very much, Professor, for your excellent presentation. I'll ask you to stay with us, since we will now give the floor to our delegates. Theo Franken is the first member of the NPA who would like to take the floor.
Good morning. So I had actually two questions for the Minister of Energy, but he had to go. So thank you for your keynotes. It was interesting. I have two questions. First of all, on hydrogen. When the Minister is talking about the fact that we can win pretty much everything with hydrogen because it's a source that is pretty much everywhere in the world available, and we need to have the half of hydrogen production in Europe and half we can import from African countries. My question is, will we not be on that point too dependent on African countries, as we see how unstable Africa and a lot of African countries are, and get even more unstable when we see what's happening with influence of Russia, Iran, China. They're not really all on our side. So when we make a big contract on hydrogen with a country and that country falls and shifts towards Russia, maybe we don't have energy anymore. And we were already dependent of energy, of Russian energy, oil and gas. So why is this a good idea to get dependent from hydrogen from African countries? Maybe it's better to just build nuclear facilities in Europe, get our renewables straight in Europe, wind and sun, solar, and get our uranium and other stuff from Canada and other NATO allies. Then we keep it in the family. It's better to keep it in the family, I think. It's always better. We have fights in the family, but it's still family at the end of the day. That's one question. So I don't really, I've had a big argument with my president of my party, who is a good friend. He wants more hydrogen from Africa. I don't. I said Africa will be like Russia was. Then they will not deliver because they don't want. There's geopolitical instability, there's discussion, and then we're out of energy another time. So I don't know. I think it's a crazy idea. Second, on desalting. I don't know how the situation is in Italy. We were in Israel and we saw the desalting process they're doing there, and the fact that they're gaining water from the sewer water from Jerusalem. It was really impressive how Israel is doing this. Personally, I'm a tourist. I'm not so often in Italy, but I'm very often in Spain. And it's really, the drought is horrible in the south of Spain, Andalusia, and a lot of other regions. And there's a lot of lack of water, a huge lack of water. And they're investing in desalting, but the investments are coming too slow. I don't know how it is in Italy. Is there enough water in the south, or is this a problem on the islands? I don't know. How is desalting processes going, and is this not something that we need to emphasize more and invest more? Because I think we will see a lot of sun, heat, climate change, but not so much rain and water in the south. So what is the desalting program of Italy? first of all, but also what is because it's also a geopolitical instrument, water. So what is the desalting program of European Union and how is NATO also working? Thank you.
Thank you, Teo. Adesso la parola al collega della Grecia.
Thank you, Theo. I'll now give the floor to our delegate from Greece.
Yes, Evangelos Apostolakis.
Evangelos Apostolakis.
Mr. President, thank you for the very nice information about the energy and the food supply. The recent worldwide food crisis stemming from increased costs of vital resources like fuel and fertilizers, climate change impacts, the COVID-19 pandemic and conflicts has severely impacted numerous of nations. Among those effects are several countries in the Middle East and the North Africa region, some of which were already facing critical food storages. The MENA region has long grappled with complex socioeconomic challenges, among which food security, inflation, and socioeconomic instability, and has also seen remarkable population growth over the last century, outpacing other global regions and resulting in an over-reliance on food imports. In consequence, it has become heavily depending on grain imports, making it vulnerable to trade disruptions due to the COVID-19 pandemic on the Russian-Ukraine war. Russia and Ukraine are both large grain exporters and were in 2015-2020 responsible for 34% of imports in the MENA region and 70% from each. In the case of complete loss of all imports from Russia and Ukraine, and assuming no substitution from elsewhere, dietary protein in MENA countries could be significantly reduced. Reducing grain imports to the MENA region will affect energy and protein supply differently depending on how the impact is shared between the food and feed sectors. Socioeconomic instability encompasses a range of issues, including high unemployment rates, income inequality, poverty, and social illness. Addressing these challenges requires comprehensive strategies accompanying investment in agricultural infrastructure, education, and governance reforms to promote inclusive growth, enhance resilience, and foster stability in the MENA region. Thank you very much.
Grazie, adesso la parola a Mimi Kodeli.
Thank you. I'll now give the floor to Mimi Kodela, representative of Albania.
Grazie Alberto. Io mi ricordo più di...
Thank you, Alberto. Over 20 years ago, I remember taking the floor as well. It was at a meeting for the Nobel Peace Prize. It's organized by the municipality of Rome, together with the Gorbachev Foundation, if I'm not mistaken. We're talking about the scarcity of drinking water, I think. We were saying that there were wars erupting because of the scarcity of water. And yet I see we're still talking about the same issue here today, 20 years later. I don't know why progress is so slow. We're still talking about the same talking. We're still talking about the scarcity of drinking water on a continent such as Africa. And yet drinking water is a fundamental right. Humans should all have access to drinking water. So all of this leads me to say that access to drinking water really has to be solved once and for all. And there are other similar problems that have been around for so long. I don't know why I get on so well with Theo today, but I seem to be agreeing with some of what he's been saying. Europe, yes, is still buying uranium even today from countries such as Russia. And that's just very difficult to understand. So I agree with Theo. Let's buy uranium from Canada. Let's keep it in the family. And family is important to all of us here today. It holds a lot of meaning. Now, I listened to the presentation by the representative of the FAO. It was very interesting. And I saw we were at 31.5% poverty rate, whereas in 2025 it will be increasing to 35.4%. Now, I asked myself the following question, and it's something I've raised during previous meetings of the MPA, by the way. I mentioned it even in Washington. 1% of the worldwide population has access to 52% of the worldwide wealth. In fact, it was 52%, but I think it's gone up to over 60%. So it's 1% of the world population who has access to more than 60% of the world's wealth. So if those are the figures, if those are the facts, what are the United Nations doing? We have all of these international organizations, many of these organizations, lots of people work there, and yet those are the figures. They speak volumes. So I'm sorry if I was a little bit lengthy here, but I did think it was important to raise. I really think we need to have deep discussions on these types of issues. After all, our future, our security are at stake. Maybe we need more trust, more unity within our family. And when I say family, I consider NATO as a family, but the European community, the European Union is also a family if my country is not considered a European country. We're not a member of that community. That being said, I want my son's future to be bright. Same for my grandson. I want their future to be brighter than mine, and that's why I'm talking about this here today. I'm a politician. And so my decisions, our decisions will have important consequences on our future. Thank you.
Abbiamo anche registrato questa piena...
Thank you, Mimi. We took good note of this agreement you have with the other Vice President as well. 2 more questions. And then we'll give the floor back to our speakers for answers. Amrouni from Algeria, you have the floor.
شكرا جزيلا. في الحقيقة من المواضيع المهمة.
Thank you very much. I think the main topic we have to cover here, and can you hear me, by the way? Okay, good. So the main topic I think that we're having to tackle within the MENA region and within Europe is that of food security and energy security. They really are two great topics. Let me recall that Algeria exports gas, is a gas exporter, and has always been a reliable and safe partner in that respect for Europe. Even as we're fighting against terrorism, that is also the case. Never have we stopped our gas exports. We've never used gas as a sort of a strategic product. No, we've always maintained gas exports. We've always seen it as a way of sustainably trading with our partners. Last year, we've held a meeting with other exporting countries, gas exporting countries. So these countries got together in view of future cooperation. And together, we tried to think about how we could cooperate to a greater extent and how we could increase our dialogue. Now, I have a question for Professor Fratin. It's a question to do with energy security. Now, first, what about technology transfer? From what we understand the European worries, if you like, when it comes to energy security. But what about technological transfers? You need technology to have access to cleaner energy. So that's my first question. And then second question, what is the right price for importers and exporters? When gas prices drop, we're being told it's all a matter of demand and supply. And yet when they increase, suddenly we're being told that there has to be a threshold, that there has to be a ceiling price. I think we need a mechanism for cooperation and dialogue to settle on a fair price for exporters and importers. Third comment. There are intense investments, considerable investments into the sustainable energy sector. In Algeria, we have a program in cooperation with Germany aiming at developing green hydrogen production. And we share this willingness to use greater amounts of renewable energy because of climate change. So we need to massively invest in all of this. That was a comment. Next, I'd launch an appeal to our partners. Let us improve energy consumption in Europe. What do I mean by that? Well, the consumption rate of energy is very high, but resources are limited in developing countries. So we need to take measures to deal with that. Yes, we need to take measures that affect production, but also to improve consumption and consumption governance in Europe. I also wanted to talk about access to water. We share the challenges that were presented in Mr. Torero's presentation from the FAO. We were really struck by the figures in his presentation. We do our best to improve the situation, and the FAO report that was recently published shows that Algeria today is ranked 45th in terms of water security. In the Sahel region, though, we need to work together to advance further on these issues and to really have water security. Thank you.
Now the
Thank you, Mohamed Amroun. And now our Finnish colleague, Kito Imon.
Thank you very much for your presentations. My question concerns about this plan which you have, this Mattei plan. It was yesterday, it was many times mentioned here, and today also. And if we think about the energy production in these countries, how many countries are involved? What kind of achievement you have achieved so far? Can you describe which kind of goals you have achieved so far? So what is the results of this plan? What kind of implements you have done with this plan? It's That's the question, yeah. Thank you.
Grazie, adesso l'ultima domanda dai...
Thank you. One last question. Our colleagues from Qatar.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. We're speaking here as an observer country. We would first and foremost like to thank our colleague from Algeria. He spoke about gas prices, and we thank him for that. We're the greatest gas producer, one of the greatest gas producers worldwide. Qatar has helped Japan after it was struck by the tsunami. We exported gas to Japan at the time. We're also an active member of the FAO. Qatar, furthermore, supported the FAO, and to a great extent, we contributed to various of their programs. Now, my question is as follows. There are companies that have access to technologies, agricultural technologies, and yet these companies do not share these technologies with countries in the Middle East. So we cannot import the seeds, for example, they have access to. So there's this monopoly. And no one seems to talk about that. So there are these private companies, research and development centers as well, that have access to some seeds and that really have a close hold on them and refuse to share the technology they develop with other countries that could benefit from it. We have, our land is very difficult to use from an agricultural point of view. It's very difficult to plant anything. So we would greatly benefit from those technologies. And yet no one seems to be talking about technology transfers toward countries that need it. Thank you.
Grazie, adesso do la parola a Paolo Messa.
Thank you. I'll now give the floor to Paolo Messa. He's going to answer the question asked by our Finnish colleague.
Grazie a tutti voi, come sempre.
Yes, thank you. Thank you to all of you for your questions and comments. As always in these kinds of conferences, I think the debate, the discussion really is the most interesting part of the session. So I'll try to answer our Finnish colleague's question. I'll be answering on behalf of I'll be giving you my own answer if you like. I'm not represented in the government here. The Mattei plan was a plan launched by the Italian government, and it's currently being implemented. So no clear results yet to answer your question. We haven't reached any specific objectives yet. However, what you should know is that the Italian government is trying to, on the one hand, optimize the results of its international cooperation, to have a more strategic vision, especially vis-a-vis African countries, keeping in mind, of course, topics such as water and food security. And on the other hand, the Italian government is working to try and align itself with the various global gateway programs launched by the European Union and the programs launched by the G7. So the idea is to really use the World Bank resources, amongst other things. So there's a lot of work that we're trying to do. We don't want to have a sort of a neo-colonial approach. No, we want to be sort of craftsmen of cooperation. So as part of the EU and the G7 initiatives, we are trying to contribute to the ongoing international efforts. Now, a quick political side note, if I may, still personally speaking, I wanted to get back to what Theo was saying. we are very grateful to our friends from Algeria and Qatar, to name but two countries present here today. We need those partners here in Italy and probably elsewhere in Europe, in Northern Europe as well. Both countries showed themselves to be available and friendly countries. Now, of course, it was in their own national interest, of course, but yes, we are a family, an inclusive and open family. We now really need to strengthen the friendships we have. Our biggest mistake would really be to close ourselves off, to isolate ourselves and end up being surrounded by neighbors that would be disappointed by us. So no, we want to be welcoming. We really want friendships, whilst, of course, keeping in mind our mutual and shared interests. So I'd like to thank Theo and all of the colleagues who have taken the floor. Thank you.
Grazie Paolo, adesso la parola.
Thank you, Paolo. Let me now give the floor to Professor. To you, Professor. Yes, thank you. I would also like to thank you for your very interesting and thought-provoking questions. I share what was said on this idea of us being a family. Our geographical positioning, if you like, means that whatever happens on one side of the Mediterranean has impacts on the other side of the Mediterranean. And I don't mean that in a political sense. Just to get back to food and energy security and to get back to this matter of nuclear energy, hydrogen, nationally produced or imported energy sources, I would say that there's one thing we mustn't forget. Depending on imports is not necessarily a sign of vulnerability. I really do hope that we've drawn a very important lesson from February 2022. In fact, I hope we've really drawn two lessons from it. First, and I'll answer the questions asked on that later on, but first and foremost, we cannot let economics guide all of our relationships with our partners, because from one day to the next, we could be faced with very nasty surprises, and some of them unpredictable. Secondly, it's all about diversification. Depending on imports, again, doesn't necessarily involve a level of vulnerability. Of course, there's also always a certain degree of vulnerability. That's simply not avoidable. But if you have a flexible and diverse supply, vulnerabilities can be somewhat alleviated. Now, we were dependent entirely on Russia, hence the crisis. We've now diversified our system a little bit. And of course, there were some positive other external factors that came to help us. The winters weren't too cold in our respective countries, so there you go. I won't talk about water because it's not really something I'm an expert on.
Avevo perso l'appunto. Allora,
Sorry, I just lost track of what I was saying. Just on the first and the third question, technology transfer investments. For me, that's the principal challenge for Europe. This transfer is going to be possible if the whole energy equation is not a closed equation, some form of bubble. No, we need to think globally here. Technology transfer is only useful if agreements are global, are broad. In other words, we must not stovepipe our relations with different countries or regions. Otherwise, we're going to pay the price. As regards fair price, the fair price, absolutely right. Very important for consumers. In the early 2000s, we were complaining about the fact that contracts were too long-term and we had absolutely no control on steering these contracts, and that we thought that, well, we need to act otherwise. Unfortunately, we learnt our lessons. The market must not lay down all the rules of the game. This is something we must retain as a lesson learnt. Many thanks, Professor. Many thanks to all. That's the end of this panel. We now are going to have a coffee break, and we'll be back with panel 2. And that'll be chaired by our colleague Calovine. Many thanks. Enjoy your coffee break.
Poi però lo deve spegnere, perché altrimenti non parlano gli altri.
Chiaro, grazie mille.
Simile.
Eccoci, questo penso che parta da
gentilmente di prendere posto in modo tale che possiamo iniziare con il...
Right, if you could all start taking your seats, and we'll launch off into this second and last panel of today's meeting. We'll stay in the same on the same topic as the early this morning: food security and climate change. And we will be dealing with migratory flows and climate change and migratory flows. This is an extremely interesting session we're opening, and it's going to start us off, and I will quote the International Observatory, which says that a large proportion of people living with food insecurity are living in war zones, suffering insecurity, violence, and this provokes migration. The number of IDPs and displaced persons and people who have to leave their homes and their countries is constantly rising. This is very sobering, and I'd like to give the floor now to our speakers. I'd like to start with Meskem Bran. I hope I've pronounced your name properly. Madam, you're Regional Director for Sustainable Development at the World Bank. And then Marco Zuppi, who is in charge of an institute called the CESPI. Dr. Bran, you have the floor.
I hope you can hear me. Yeah. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak at this session. It's really been very exciting to hear the conversations that are taking place, and I'm honored to have the opportunity to share with you the impact of climate change on development in the MENA region. So drawing on the extensive research that we've done at the World Bank, and I'm trying to give you here a sense of the types of research that we've done that will be very informative. And drawing on these, I'll share with you, first of all, how climate change is impacting the MENA region, both Middle East and North Africa. And second, I'll discuss its implications for migration, and then I'll give some examples of specific actions that need to be taken to address this very complex challenge. The very first message that I would like to share with you is that the MENA region is warming up twice as fast as the rest of the world. And so the economic and the human costs are really, really significant. While the rest of the world is projected to warm up by 3 degrees by the end of the century, in MENA we expect the region to reach these warming temperatures just by the mid of this century. So such a high and a fast level of warming will have really major implications, particularly on water and food security. We discussed that earlier this morning. So when it comes to water, the MENA region is among the most water-stressed parts of the world. Over 60% of MENA's population actually lives in areas with high water stress, and you can see this in the map. The maroon parts reflect MENA, and you'll see that the region is at risk of depleting its water resources. Over 70% of MENA's GDP is actually generated in these areas of very high water stress. And you can compare that to the global average, which is just 22%. So countries like Yemen, Tunisia, Jordan, Palestine, they all have per capita water availability well below the absolute minimum requirements for human needs. So if we sort of project forward and look at a 2-degree warming world, we expect that freshwater resources would drop by 15 to 45%. If temperatures increase any further, up to 4 degrees Celsius, we expect that freshwater availability will be depleted by 75%. So those are really, really staggering numbers. And we're starting to already see how this is panning out now. So I'd like to give you an example of Iraq. We are witnessing the devastating effects of water scarcity induced by climate change due to record low rainfall, rising temperatures, the Mesopotamian marshes. This is believed to be the birthplace of large-scale agriculture, which emerged about 12,000 years ago. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. I mean, these marshes are drying out. They have been a diverse, home for a diverse range of fish and bird life, migratory birds, and so forth. But beyond the cultural and environmental value, the marshes are a source of livelihood for a very large population of the south of Iraq who depend on agriculture for their income. So this combination of water scarcity and a warming climate is resulting in reduced agricultural production, which is in turn, of course, affecting food security in the region, and it's really taking a very heavy toll on the poor. And we had a very excellent discussion from our colleague from the FAO this morning, so I won't belabor that, but you can really see how the region is experiencing very, very serious food insecurity. So let's take Egypt as an example. Due to the combined effects of climate change, we predict by 2050, food production is going to fall by 5.7%. And this will happen at a time when the population itself will be increasing by about 37%. Let's take Tunisia as another example. We predict that due to water scarcity, the production of Tunisia's storied olive oil sector is going to actually dip by 70% if no action is taken. The population, as many of you know, and economic activities in North Africa in particular are to a large extent concentrated in coastal areas. Another threat, again, induced by climate change is sea level rise. It's really a brewing threat across North Africa. And in Tunisia, we see that the rising sea level and coastal erosion is projected to lower GDP by 6.9% by 2050, and this will have huge impacts on jobs and livelihoods. And let's take a look at an example of what we're already starting to witness. So this is the coast of Hammamet. Some of you may know the beautiful coastline there. So the green area shows the beach that was present in 2006, and you can see how it has already dramatically shrunk in 2019. This is actually, it's even narrower today than it was in 2019. So thus far, I've talked about the impact of climate change on the slow onset impacts. But another factor that we need to consider is also climate shocks or extreme weather events such as floods. As you can see in this graph, the red is MENA. The impacts of extreme weather events are much more acute in MENA and much more frequent than they are in the rest of the world. So it's happening at greater frequency and with greater impact. And to give you an example, between 1990 and 2020, a typical climate shock in MENA was 20 times more costly compared to the rest of the world. One example that is still very present in our minds is the tragic floods in Libya in September of last year. And these side-by-side pictures show you the scale of the damages. The World Bank estimated that the economic impact of those losses were about $1.6 $1.65 billion. And this single one event in one place actually resulted in the displacement of 44,000 people. And the final climate impact that I'd like to share with you is heat waves. Heat waves are becoming more prevalent and more dangerous, especially when coupled with poor service delivery, such as electricity and water. In some countries, this is actually leading to public protests. For example, Iraqis have increasingly taken to the streets in recent years to protest the impacts of climate change. In fact, since 2018, we've seen scorching temperatures that have really pushed Iraq's power grid and its water systems to the brink of failure. And this has tended to spark annual climate-related protests. The most recent of these happened in July of last year. So with MENA warming up twice as fast as the rest of the world, how is it impacting people? This brings me to the second finding of our work that I'd like to share with you, is that with water scarcity and deterioration of rural livelihoods and coastal economies, we're already starting to observe climate hotspots. So these climate hotspots will emerge in MENA as early as 2030. And I'd like to show you what this means on the map. So challenges in water availability happen to be the main driver of climate migration in North Africa. And if you take a look at the map, the blue dot shows you areas that are currently facing water scarcity, or what I'll call areas of out-migration hotspots, or these are ecosystems that are and livelihoods that are currently facing vulnerabilities. And the red dots are the areas to which people will be migrating. If you look at Egypt, you'll see that the eastern and western portions of the Nile Delta, including Alexandria, could become out-migration hotspots. These are areas that are already starting to feel the stress due to both declining water availability and sea level rise. So our research indicates that climate change is strongly linked to internal migration. People will move within their own countries in places that have better water availability, resources, and livability. So in North Africa, this means people will move to urban centers like Cairo or Algiers or Tunis or Tripoli or the Casablanca Rabat corridor or to Tangiers. So this brings me to the third and final finding I want to share with you. So how many people do you anticipate will become climate migrants? And let's start at the continental level in Africa. So at the continental level, we predict that by 2050, there will be 105 million internal climate migrants at the continental scale. But we also know that with such large numbers of people on the move, it's also likely that pressures will start to build for cross-border migration. Now, let's focus on North Africa, the subject of our discussion at this GSM seminar. We predict by 2050 there will be 19 million internal migrants. This is actually the highest number of climate migrants per capita anywhere in the world. And to put this in perspective, 19 million is actually the equivalent of 1.5 times the current population of Tunisia. So these numbers are quite staggering. And we anticipate by 2050, North Africa could become both a source as well as a transit stop for climate migrants. So the question, I think, for all of us to answer is, can we really mitigate this impending catastrophe? And the answer is absolutely yes, if we act now. So climate-driven migration can be lowered by as much as 80%, if we take a certain number of actions. There are 3 things that we can all do. So the first recommendation I'd like to highlight is that clearly cutting global emissions remains our best bet for mitigating the worst impacts of climate change. So mitigation really remains one of the most effective forms of climate adaptation. 9 years after the Paris Agreement, the world is still headed towards a 3-degree warming by the next century. Ambitious action to curb global emissions is critical for us to reduce the burden of climate change. So it's really important for highly emitting economies to really take on the responsibility of lowering their emissions. So the second recommendation I'd like to offer is that we need to close the development gaps and support communities that currently are facing climate stress. So helping communities adapt in place is really critical. We have viable and sensible solutions that actually have been proven to help communities adapt. You could, for example, work on restoring vital ecosystems. You can better start managing water consumption through lowering distribution, losses in the distribution network. You can have better irrigation systems, and you can build resilient agriculture, food systems. There's lots of things to be done, and we at the World Bank are already doing many of these. And the final recommendation is that we also need to recognize leaving areas that are uninhabitable is an important adaptation strategy. So from this perspective, we really need to help support communities in MENA, which are going to be receiving climate migrants from places that are become uninhabitable. So these in-migration hotspots are mainly cities, so they will need to have support in efficient urban planning and infrastructure development and providing social services and employment creation, which is really critical, and social integration because people will be coming from different parts of the country and so forth. So there's preparation and anticipation of migration is one of the best ways in which MENA countries can be supported. So at the World Bank, we are working very hard with our partner countries in implementing all 3 of these recommendations. Our mission is to end extreme poverty and boost shared prosperity on a livable planet, and that's really important to us, the livable planet aspect, and I'm very happy to share with you some of the concrete actions that we're doing and the resources that we're mobilizing. We're putting up about $40 billion to help countries around the world respond to climate change that's an impact, and we're making sure that at least 45% of that goes towards climate action. So the needs are huge and beyond the capacity of any single player. So we need both the clarity of purpose and we need to have political resolve, and this needs to translate also to financing and for all of us to work together in a coordinated fashion. And I'd like to leave you with one graph so that if we all work together in partnership, you can see how dramatically climate migration could be reduced. So thank you so much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Grazie dottoressa Brain per le sue preoccupanti, in qualche modo ovviamente anche, dichiarazioni che ci ha appena rilasciato. A questo punto lascio la parola al professor Marco Zuppi.
Grazie, si sente? Sì, grazie.
Many thanks for what you've said, and I'm very glad to speak to you today. And what I'd like to say is give you a couple of headline messages, if I may. Given the importance of these important problems, we often underline what renders them most specific, but in fact they're very much interlinked. I'm going to give you some data which may help you to see what they have in common, because we always base ourselves on data. Now, we don't have all the data that we need, but nonetheless, what we have, we can understand that there are some common factors in these phenomena behind climate change and migration. These two issues are multidimensional. as analysts, we try and make the distinction between the different kinds of migration, asylum seeking, refugees, etc., as defined by international law, and voluntary migration. But of course, the reality of everybody's life means that things are much more complex and much more nuanced.
Ben illustrato finora.
And climate change also has the multiplying factor. And it can also heighten patterns that were already visible. And there is another element that is important. And here I'll just show you some of my slides. Migration can be seen as an internal issue to a country. We spoke of displaced people within borders. We spoke of regional migration. And the Mediterranean, from an environmental standpoint, is very specific. Environmentally speaking, it's very wealthy. And we can say that the Mediterranean territory is one of the most diversified territory. It's a fragile and a vulnerable area in terms of diversity, but also very important in terms of diversity. So, predictions say that on both sides of the Mediterranean, we share challenges. That's the starting point. Then every country has its own specificities and so on. Here with this map, we can see that temperatures are increasing. We are going from yellow to red, and the increase in temperature is very obvious. So here's the first piece of information. It's the migration pattern. What we see is that the migration flows are both regular and irregular. On both sides of the Mediterranean, there is inward migration and outward migration. And migration can also be explained via structural patterns. And when it comes to climate change, we must, on the one hand, find immediate solutions, but long-term, and on the other hand, long-term strategies. And so politicians have to find a middle ground between the two. And it's true that often elected representatives tend to opt for short-term solutions. However, this can have a negative impact on the long-term vision and the long-term focus of an issue. Here we are comparing Southern Europe and Northern Africa. You have two lines, and they show a clear difference in terms of annual population growth. We're very well aware that in Europe, the population is slowing down. In some countries, it's there's no full renewal of the population, and in Africa, yes, population growth is declining, but the rate of slowing down is not so fast. So here you have the age structure in 2020. On the left, you have Europe. And here, the part of the population that is above 65 years old represents 1/5 of inhabitants and 5% above 65 in the MENA region. And these are the age structure predictions for 2040. And they are very telling. And they are usually very reliable. And in Europe, in 2040, 26% of the population will be above 65 years of age. But there will also be an increase in age in Northern Africa, but to a lesser extent. Here's another piece of information that is very interesting, I believe. So in both regions, there are migration flows. Europe is mostly characterized by a number of internal migration flows. And a bigger part of the population migrates towards countries where the revenue is medium or higher. In Europe, 40% of migrants come and go to these upper middle income and lower middle income economies. Now, on the southern flank of the Mediterranean, there is migration from countries where the revenue is much lower. So there is a specific migrant profile. In Europe, the migration is mostly cross-regional. In blue, you see the places of origin, so Southern Europe, Eastern Europe. That's the biggest percentage. However, in North Africa, most of the migration comes and goes to Eastern Africa. Another important statistic, and it's once again the migration flows in Europe. They are very irregular. As you see it here, there was a peak in 2015. It's always interesting to see where the migrants came from. But the 2015 data is very unusual. You see that following that, it's stabilized downwards. Now, when we compare the data of the different European countries, if we look at the nationality of the immigrant population, in yellow, we see the African populations. So this is the case of Spain, arrival in Spain, and we compare 2019 with 2016. Same for the other countries. In Italy, in the first column in 2020, we have Morocco, Nigeria. Those are the country from which most migrants come from to go to Italy. In Germany, migration flows are quite high, but very rarely is the country of origin Africa, an African country. Same thing for other European countries. So irregular migration is something that we focus on a lot in Europe, but as you can see, there is a very structural dimension to migration, which here is characterized by regular migration. Most migrants migrate as part of the so-called regular migration. And then migration flows happen within borders and cross-border. Here's a bit of data on international cooperation. The public aid to development has to face emerging trends such as humanitarian disasters and more long-term elements, so development strategies. And over the decades, humanitarian aid had to cover a wider range of topics and saw its mission, its core mission change. And over the years, climate change became one of the reasons why development cooperation was implemented.
Questo è un dato che ha a che vedere con...
On this graph, it's linked to development cooperation. So European donor countries provide help in the form of finance or activities in the beneficiary countries. But because of migration, we've seen over the last years, especially in European countries, that an important part of the funds were used to welcome and according in line with the OECD rules, so to welcome the migrants. In green, you can see that between 2018 and 2023, there was an increase of in-donor refugee costs, which was covered by donors. So an increase in the structural costs of welcoming migrants. And this is an emerging element. To that, we must add the dimension of emergency humanitarian aid in yellow. And by adding these two elements, we have an element of development cooperation, but in the short term, not in the long run. Therefore, it's very complex to tackle challenges which require a short-term intervention and a long-term vision. Now, in red, a number of countries have been circled, and these countries have an important share of in-donor refugee costs. A number of them are European now. Actually, a third of bilateral cooperation and money spent is for welcoming refugees. So there are a number of priorities that have to be tackled, and they are all legitimate, of course, but they need efficient instruments.
Nel caso della Banca Mondiale, ma anche a livello di altre organizzazioni multilaterali.
And when we speak of the World Bank and as part of other multilateral organizations, the UN specifically, there is more and more focus in mitigating the impact of climate change. And this is one of the topics as well that we look at. But there are other challenges. We spoke of water stress, food, energy. But there are more and more challenges. Climate change. And beyond all the political elements around it, so maybe political rivalry between states and so on, because a number of issues are tied to environmental policy. And the issue of climate change concerns a number of institutions, and therefore there needs to be a broader cooperation between organizations and institutions. Climate change not only falls under one single sector anymore. And we see here a share of bilateral aid for climate change adaptation and or mitigation. So we've tried to identify cross-cutting themes. Initially, we spoke of climate change, but now, of course, we've gone more into detail. So we're speaking of fighting against climate change. We speak of adaptation, mitigation. So when we speak of cross-cutting themes, we need to keep in mind the general impact and the goal of a program on mitigating or adapting climate change or its effects. So once again, we mustn't stovepipe all of these areas. What is important is that all of the initiatives that we will carry out focus and take into account all of the cross-cutting effects, because all of these challenges and climate change has a multiplying effect. So here I would like to give you a few examples. So there is the humanitarian emergencies, but there are also structural long-term emergencies. And when we speak of development cooperation in the region, here I'm taking the example of Yemen. 3/3 of development cooperation is for humanitarian aid. Same when it comes to Syria. And I'll wrap up using these examples. But if you look at the structural data, so if you look at history, the historical reasons why crisis spark and sometimes unsolvable crisis, which has an impact on the population. If you look at that, you can still see that cooperation development goes towards the humanitarian emergency. And now we're all aware of the emergency in Gaza and Palestine. This is what was on the slide. And this data shows that the cost of war means that we need to ask ourselves questions about development cooperation, which should invest in the long term, but unfortunately is forced to look at the short term. And we are also in a context where all phenomena are linked to each other and overlap one another. And once again, they lead to all kind of migration flows, whether regional or inside regions, within borders. So we need to broaden our vision, broaden our line of sight, and try and see what happens on the other side. There are surely common denominators, but there are often differences, specificities that need to be taken into account in development cooperation. And budgets have to be drafted also very finely because resources are limited. And when we work with development cooperation, we need enough resources. However, when there aren't enough resources to meet the ambition of the EU or of other organizations, that's when issues arise.
Grazie, Direttore Zuppi. Abbiamo tempi purtroppo.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We don't have a lot of time left, so we will now give the floor to delegates. So our Greek colleague wants to take the floor. I have noted his name down. So, Greece, you have the floor.
Two Greek colleagues, actually. We have to pick some.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. President. We are thanking for the informations. We are not so happy after all these informations. But we have to notice some things. Nowadays, it is more than evident that there is a significant correlation between climate change and destabilization and rise of the violence in the affected areas. The MENA region is already one of the most affected areas on the planet by climate change, and the future of the region prosperity is strongly doubted. The Middle East and North Africa are particularly vulnerable to the effect of climate changes, including water scarcity, desertification, and extremely weather events. These environment challenges can exacerbate existing social and political tensions, leading to conflict and instability. Moreover, environment degradation can undermine livelihoods, increase poverty, and contribute to migration flows, which in Iran can strain resources and social cohesion in destination countries, including those in Europe. The security challenges across the Sahel and North Africa directly affect EU security in several ways, and instability and conflict in the region can lead to large-scale displacement and migration flows towards Europe as people flee violence, persecution, and lack of economic opportunities. This can strain EU border controls, overwhelm reception systems, and fuel political tensions between EU. Moreover, the speed of terrorism and extremism in the MENA region can directly threaten European security. Additionally, immigration flows can be instrumentalized and used as a tool in the context of hybrid warfare in order to cause destabilization of EU member states, especially in the south. I have a question. Climate change in the MENA region poses a great threat for the Euro-Atlantic security in so many ways, and it is a multifaceted and complex challenge that could be faced as such. Given the aforementioned, are there any appropriate measures that should be taken immediately by both NATO and the EU and by member states? Thank you.
I think it's better if we collect all the questions because we don't have many times, and I want to ask you if you
have the floor. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for two excellent presentations that, in my mind, is the last very sobering part of this two-day session. We've heard about, we've discussed Ukraine, we discussed Russia, we discussed China and Taiwan, we discussed Iran and the danger to Middle Eastern and global security. We've discussed all our grave security challenges, but this is the most sobering part of those 2 days because, in my mind, climate change, or should I phrase it more properly, the climate crisis is upon us already. We need not make predictions. The impact of climate change is already affecting our populations, our countries, our nations, our governments. And I think it's very essential for all of us in order to realize the degree and the magnitude of the problem is to perceive it as a serious security challenge. This is a security challenge just as grave as a military confrontation, make no mistake about it. I found myself in Turkey last April and discussed, after the earthquake had hit, earthquakes of course are not linked to the climate crisis, but they constitute a large-scale security, actually natural disaster. And I asked my Turkish colleague, what kind of military power could inflict within less than 1 minute more than 60,000 fatal casualties? Unless we're talking about a nuclear strike, of course. There is no power in the world that would inflict such a disaster in terms of not only displaced but dead people. Thereby, I wanted to make the point that this is indeed a security challenge that we all have to face. Now, as you understand, Greece is concerned about the problem. That we took the floor, both delegates on the Greek, maybe because we had to face more than 80 wildfires within a day in April, too early for the wildfire season. Or maybe because we had to cancel defense projects, defense procurement projects, in order to find 3 billion plus in relief aid to farmers in central Greece that had to suffer severe floods last September. However, this is climate change in action. The MENA region, of course, is severely affected. We face desertification prospects in at least the northern shores of the Mediterranean, and that means that we will not be able to accommodate those people displaced, let's say, from the Sahel region, if we've already become desertified as the years go on. So we feel that not much is done about this in terms of collective action. Collective action is what is needed. If Greece, small Greece, decides to take all the necessary measures, but the big industrial consumers do not comply, like China or the US, for example, then it's all for nothing. Unless we decide to act collectively, realize the problem, face up to its consequences, then it's not enough. And one last point, sir. We're developing, since we're all linked to security and defense, 5th generation aircraft, and we're thinking of spending hundreds of millions on it, and unmanned aerial vehicles. However, the production line for the most operational firefighting airplane only opened up and became operational last year after many years of inaction. That, in my mind, is the core of the problem, that we're not investing enough in tackling climate change, and this is because of the fact that we are not realizing the severity of the problem. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We can start with some reply, and then I collect some other questions, but please remember that we have a very short time. Thanks. You go.
Thank you so much for the questions. I think what you've both highlighted is that climate change needs a collective response, and that it's really not the one single country or one single agency that can respond to it. We really need to come together as a global community. We need to bring the private sector on board. We need to look at mechanisms by which both the public and the private sector actually work together, and of course communities that are concerned as well. So I couldn't agree more with you than highlighting the urgency of climate change, and that it really requires a whole of the world type of response.
Sì, anch'io sono.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I also agree with what was just said. Now, climate-related migration, it's more of a political term than an analytical term. It involves a bit of ambiguity. But again, it's more of a political matter, I would say, climate migration. In defense and security, traditionally speaking, NATO shows that cooperation is necessary. Now, we want politicians to enable us to overcome a certain number of challenges. And right now, institutionally, we don't have all of the necessary instruments to deal with the various challenges we're having to face. I really think there has to be action at different levels. We have to really look into the economic, political, environmental, and institutional challenges.
Comment from Luxembourg. Microphone, please.
Yes.
Thanks.
Hi. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for the presentations. I think we recognize that climate change is a threat to NATO and its allies, not only because of immigration, that's only a very small part of it, but also because of the threat to military operations and installations, as NATO PA has insisted on in multiple reports over the years. I was very interested in hearing from Mrs. Brown on the food production decline because of water scarcity. And I was wondering whether you have any numbers on if we can at least mitigate that decline through innovation. I totally agree that we need to reduce emissions and so on. The question is, in a non-perfect world we are living in, are there ways to mitigate that decline through innovations in productivity, and has that been considered? And maybe for both of you, we spoke a lot about internal migration, and if over the last days we spoke about migration, we often spoke about migration from the global south to the global north. We didn't speak a lot about the threats to security when it comes to migration, that it's not internal to a country, but stays internal in the region, whether it's in the Middle East or in the African region. Have you any thoughts on that, maybe? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Senatrice Castello.
Grazie molte. È stato veramente un onore partecipare.
It was an honor for me to take part in these 2 days. Really very enlightening work. I wanted to get back to the question raised by our speakers today. Yeah, I think we all need to start thinking about migration as an opportunity for greater development. Recently published data by the UN shows that by 2050 there will be over 200 million climate migrants. So clearly this is a strong phenomenon, and we can't simply ignore it. We can't stop it. No, we have to more or less control it. How can we turn this into an opportunity is the question I ask. How can we make sure it contributes to our country's wealth? In various Italian reports, but also, I think, in many other countries, we've highlighted the fact that we need human resources. Our populations are aging, and so we need young people to come and work on our in our various companies. Germany is one example that shows that integration can be an added value for the host country. Clearly, if we work together, I think our continent could welcome refugees and integrate them better. Thank you.
Grazie, Senatrice. Yamila Levko from...
Thank you. Czech Republic?
Hello, I'm not from Yarmila, I'm Andre, but you're from Czech Republic, that's fine. Yarmila is just sitting next to me. All right.
I have my speaker.
Thank you. I'm Andre, I'm a member of the Czech Parliament. Is this the morning? Good morning, colleagues. I have a question that is close to the question what Sven had. First, thank you both directors, Ms. Brahne and Ms. Supi, for great description of the routes that do cause migration. And I completely agree with what was said, that these are the routes that NATO may face as a threat in the future. I mean, to find the best way how to settle the illegal part of it, because we can't stop migration, we can lower it, we can settle, and we can say no to the illegal part. My question would be, it is really complex. The routes that you've been describing, it's a complex of climate change, conflicts that come from political ways, and my question is, can we have, where can we invest the money that we put in? Because either we have to invest it into armies, and we create Fortress Europe, that will be complicated, not possible really to have the fortress, and it's against our point of view on human rights. Or we find the best way to invest. I don't know, Italian colleagues were telling us about their plan, Mati plan. So is it technologies that we should support? And that's the main issue that where I want to ask. Is it the technologies we should support? Is it the innovation in farming? Is it the innovation in energy? Is this the place where we should invest the most? And I know it's complicated to do it in the regimes which are not stable, but we have to find a way how to do that. So my question would be here, or would you recommend a different solution? Because I'm sure it's a set of solutions, but I have a feeling that if we fight the climate change, then we have to help to adapt, and then the only thing that we can use is some innovation. So that would be the question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And the last question from Georgios Karolas from Cyprus. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Migration is a significant issue, and climate change is a pull factor that intensifies the whole phenomenon, and it affects directly the countries, especially those in the front line of the border of the Euro-Atlantic region. For example, Cyprus has a crisis regarding migration. 6% of the population are irregular immigrants. So it's a big issue for Cyprus. It's a number disappropriate to our population. So what I move on is that countries with these increased flows of immigrants are in danger. The cohesion of the country, the security of country is in danger because of all these flows that we receive. And also due to the deficit of natural resources. We also in Cyprus have a problem with the water. So we have to manage the crisis effectively. So to protect our geopolitical and cohesion. NATO, in cooperation with the EU, what actions are planned to take to manage this crisis? How does NATO thinks or plans to extend its umbrella to cover the whole Mediterranean, and also to start a dialogue with the countries that are not NATO members, to start a dialogue to shape and reshape the policies regarding the architecture of security and defense, so as to put in the map the issues of irregular immigration. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. It was a joke. There is another question. The last question from Italy, Paolo Formentini.
Mike, please.
Ringrazio tutti e due gli oratori.
Yeah, so I'd like to also thank both of our speakers this morning. It was really very useful to listen to you. Yes, we need to understand how we can best use available resources. And that's also true when thinking about security and defense, because as we saw yesterday, Russia and other powers use and weaponize migration. Russia's doing it today, but who knows which countries will do it in the future. And that's a sort of a characteristic of hybrid warfare, weaponizing migration. Now, we're fighting climate change, yes. It's important because it has an impact on migration, on our security. If we want to be entirely consistent, though, we need to take into account that all of this requires financial resources. We're taking measures, of course, to limit the effects of climate change. But we're importing batteries and solar panels from China to mitigate the effects of climate change. And yet these panels are being produced with energy produced by with coal. So it's very much of a contradiction. So the real question is, how can we fight climate change without completely destroying the industry in Europe itself.
Finito. You can start. You can reply.
Allora, brevemente, perché sono tutte
Rapidement, parce que
nuovi.
No, these are many aspects to your questions. We're talking about the differences between national, regional, and international migrations. You were mentioning China, and we're talking about 100 million Chinese migrating within China. That is our data, and that's a reality because, and it does have a structural aspect and an impact on our security. Recently, this has become, in recent years, this has become a major issue. As to inequality between the North and the South, there are differences between the North and the South, but in the last 30 years, what we have seen is a reduction between these, in the inequality of these two regions, whereas inequalities between countries has increased. This has territorial impact, something which derives from the past, as sort of an economic model around different hubs. Inequality of economic and territorial nature, but also gender inequality, which comes into play, and also generational inequality between generations. And this is something which must concern us with our aging populations. We have elsewhere in the world a large proportion of young inhabitants, and I think this is something we should seize as an opportunity. And this is something which escapes us when we talk about North-South questions. So people of university age, and 80% of graduates come from southern countries, an enormous potential reservoir for us, which we must be able to use. And, well, we've spoken about financial ways of tackling this, but in long-term strategies, we need to think of complementarity between the different ways of tackling the issue. Now, we are facing climate change and migratory flows, but we must think in this more broad sense. A very small percentage of our budget is devoted to these issues. We must spend more. And when talking about traditional security and military security, military interventions for human safety are an important issue. Which require innovative approaches. While not forgetting that we must work on issues of common interest. Too little investment in innovation.
Thank you very much. I know time is short, so I'll be yeah, I'll be very quick. But I think the two questions from the colleague from the Czech Republic and Luxembourg are interrelated. So thank you for that. So on food production, this is an area on which we do work a lot, And as you said, I think climate, what we call climate smart agriculture, and really finding ways of, for instance, optimizing water use. There are technologies now that allow you to use every single drop of water for a very specific plant, so like no water has gone to waste. So there are technologies that allow you to do that, modernizing the irrigation system, for instance. So we're working on that. And then also there's a lot of work that's already done on resilient seeds. We know even ancient grains that are very resistant to drought, that how do you reintroduce some of those? So it's really a matter of helping farmers change their farming practices, but not just on their own, but also making sure that you're getting innovative technologies and systems of producing that may be in other countries, right? You know, even here in Europe, the Southern Europe, there's a lot of technologies, and that's, you know, one way of ensuring and optimizing the resource use. I think one of the questions is how do we best use our resources? I think as knowledge transfer is one of the core ways in which we could continue to help countries become much more food self-sufficient is too strong a word, but are actually able to produce much more food locally using these technologies. Maybe on water too, there's a lot of work that's been done on technologies for reuse of wastewater. I mean, Singapore, for instance, is able to completely reuse all of their wastewater. In MENA, we're actually doing quite a bit of work in helping countries reuse wastewater. Desalinization is one. Saudi Arabia actually has managed to bring down the cost of desalinization at, you know, very impressive rates. And so how do you bring, you know, a combination of different sources of water while at the same time mitigating the environmental impact? You know, those are some of the things that we're working on, and I think that's an area where you could, as NATO members, can also encourage your parliaments to continue to support ODA in a way that helps communities stay in place, because what we know is climate migration is impacting the countries that are experiencing climate impacts. So the best way to help them is to help support countries. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the speakers. Thank you, everybody. And I think it's time for the President Cesa and the President Guterres. Oh, thank you. I don't have here my card, but I can send you an email or message because, okay, perfect. It's really interesting for the slide. Thanks. Thank you.
Davvero, chiudiamo questi nostri lavori e
So, we've come to the end of our session, and it's my pleasure to thank you both, all of you rather, for being here, the delegations from the different countries present, and I'd like to thank first and foremost the Speaker of the Italian Assembly for having been here, and for the words of welcome that we heard from him. I'd like to thank the Speaker of the Senate, and many thanks to Ruxandra and all her team at the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, our friend Gutierrez, General Gutierrez, next to me, for the excellent work that he is doing within the Parliamentary Assembly. I'd like to thank all those organizing the GSM. I'd like to thank our staff, Fabrizia, Pia, and all our support.
colleghi della delegazione.
and our friends and colleagues from the delegations. After all, this was an example of teamwork. We have managed to organize and run a very successful session over 2 days. I think we can say it's a landmark. We have worked on, for months, really interesting ambassadors to come. This really paid off within NATO, but also with our partners with whom we have every interest to cooperate. Now, of course, the key topic for the GSM is drawing NATO's attention and keeping it on our southern flank on the Mediterranean basin. And I'm talking about the broader Mediterranean. After all, you know, this is a colossal task. Having heard 25 speakers coming from all corners of this region, I can only say that a big word of thanks. What remains to be done from now on is at the Sofia meeting and in Washington that we should really make all our friends and colleagues aware of the specifically Mediterranean and Gulf-related issues and all the subjects we've discussed today. The Minister of Defense spoke to us yesterday about the different challenges with the different flanks, cybersecurity, all the different domains. And of course, the Mediterranean really does dovetail into this. So prevention is better than cure, and we must act as soon as possible because, given the different situations we have been facing these past few weeks and months in the Middle East, I think it's time now to really start acting. And within the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, we really need to do our job as whistleblowers for the Mediterranean, if you will. Many thanks, and many thanks to all countries for those who contributed to this. We've seen some slightly tense moments. I've spoken to our Turkish, Algerian friends around dinner yesterday and our Israeli friends also. Now, I've said so, I'm saying so publicly, and I've said to them personally, let us be careful in the way we speak, measured in our pronouncements, because we are here to promote unity, dialogue, to find solutions. After all, our common theme must be NATO's common theme, is in consulendo liber. So in other words, all together. And I always say to my colleagues who go to the different meetings in the world, I always say the same thing. I say, remember what NATO is about, peace. And I think I'll leave it there. And once again, many thanks. I mean, how can I thank you enough? Thank you very much, and I close the session.
Thank you very much, dear Lorenzo, for your exact words. We all agreed with. Ladies and gentlemen, now we are arrived, come to just the final point of our meeting. In my capacity as the chair of the GSM, I would like to start by thanking Lorenzo Cesa as the head of the Italian delegation to our assembly, his colleagues from the delegation, all of you, and the speakers of the two parliaments, of the two chambers of the parliament of Italy, for putting together this excellent seminar and hosting us with such grace and elegance. I would also like to applaud the great efforts of the excellent, dedicated, and efficient Italian staff led by the Secretary of Delegation, Pia Califano, Stefania Perocci, Manuela Ambrogio, Fabio Pontillo, Mario Di Napoli, and the rest of the team. Thank you for the huge effort. Thank you so much for the sorry. I apologize for that. I would equally like to thank our staff from the NATO PA Secretariat, Secretary General Rosandra Popa on my right, the Director of the GSM, Paul Cook. Thank you. Matthew Jablonski, Ethan Corbin, Valentina Di Folga, and their very capable researcher, Pilar Bolognesi. Many thanks to our excellent speakers from those 2 days, from Italy and beyond, and to our rapporteur, Theo Franken, who has just left, for presenting his excellent report on Russia's activities that has to be concluded during the summer. Of course, I would like to extend also a heartfelt thanks to the interpreters for their remarkable work. Without them, our discussions could not have taken place. Thank you. Last but not least, I would like to thank all of you for taking the time and making the effort to travel to Rome to participate. Well, to travel to Rome is always a pleasure. It's not a difficulty, but to participate in these important deliberations at a moment of great challenges to both allied countries and to our partners and friends in the broader MENA region. Over the past 2 days, today and yesterday, we have learned a great deal, both from our excellent speakers, but also from our exchanges of perspectives and views. Our conversation helped clarify our differences, very slight differences. Lorenzo Cesa has just raised some of them, but we are here for working, as he said, for peace, and shine a light on the path towards ultimate agreement. We are politicians, we have to discuss, we have to debate, we have to show different approaches to the problems, but at the end we are sharing values and goals. This is the most essential democratic process of all, and it illustrates how can we collectively work out peaceful ways to resolve tensions and avoid conflict. Discussions like ours capture the essence of the democratic spirit that this assembly works so hard to capture continuously. Now, to the logistics, to all colleagues who are traveling to Naples, a reminder that the official buses will leave at 14:30 sharp. No more or less, but sharp. But some more or less. From Piazza Montecitorio, close to here, so very, very close to here. This visit is for NATO members countries only. Please arrive ahead of departure time, 14:30, just we can leave sharp. For those living here in Rome, I hope you return to your respective parliaments with new ideas and insights to guide your work. The Secretariat will also keep you informed of plans for future GSM activities. I wish you a safe journey home, and I take this opportunity to express my immense gratitude to Italy for hosting us. Thank you so much, Italy, and thank you to all you all. Thank you. And this is the end, really the end. Thank you.